Hey, Washington Campus, Brad here with some Christmas encouragement and a look ahead at what's going to be happening this coming Sunday. But first, let me ask you a question. On your Christmas tree, what do you put on top? Do you have a star? Do you have an angel or something else? I think star is probably the most common, but I want to hear from you. Put it in the comments below what you have on top of your Christmas tree, and we'll see what's the most common or most popular Christmas tree topper. Well, the reason that many of us put a star on our tree or that a star shows up around the Christmas season is because a star features somewhat prominently in the Christmas story that we have in the Bible. In Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, Matthew writes this. He says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him.'" So over the years, many have tried to figure out exactly who these wise men or magi were. And some would say, well, we just really can't know. But I think the Bible gives us some really important clues so that we can figure out and understand more about who they were and why they showed up when they did. So when they say they were from the east, this would have been the area that we would look at and see modern day Iraq. And that part of the world had been the seat of many great empires over the centuries. At the time that Matthew's writing, it's the Parthians. Before them, it had been the Greeks. And before the Greeks, it had been the Persians. Before the Persians, it had been the Babylonians. And before the Babylonians, it had been the Assyrians. And so this would have been the part of the world that they came from. And that word magi actually begins to show up in ancient writings around the time of the Babylonian Empire. And what magi were is these were wise men. They were called that because these were really advisors to the kings and the rulers of empires. These were men that would have taken their rudimentary understanding of science. They also would pay attention to mathematics, to agriculture, to history, astronomy, and astrology. And yes, they would even work in some occult practices. And they would take all of that, all of these different things, and they would try to discern the future, predict the times, and just understand and advise kings and rulers accordingly. So it's no surprising that these men would have noticed something unique, a star in a unique kind of way shining. So that's no surprise that would have caught their attention. But we're still left with, okay, why would they connect a star in the sky with events in Israel so many miles away? Well, this is where it gets really interesting. And I think the clue, what helps us can understand this, is go back to the Old Testament book of Daniel. Now, if you remember, now Daniel's happening many, many years earlier, many years prior. This is when Israel's getting taken into captivity. And Daniel, as a young boy, is taken into captivity by the Babylonian Empire. So he's transported from Jerusalem to the Babylonian Empire. And so while there in Daniel chapter 1 and 2, you can kind of read this story, he distinguishes himself in many ways. And one of the things that happens to Daniel is, at that time, the ruler has a dream, and he brings in his magi, brings in his wise men, and says, "Tell me about my dream and what it means." And they can't do it. And so now there's panic. They're all going to be executed. They go, and Daniel says, "You know what? I can interpret the dream. God will allow me to interpret the dream." And he does. As a result of that, we remember that Daniel receives favor. But I want to read this verse because I think we often overlook something very significant that happens to Daniel. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 48, it says this. This is after Daniel interprets the dream. "Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon." Did you catch that last part? Daniel not only gets a position of authority, but he's also given the authority over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel now is in charge of them. So think about what that would mean, that responsibility, that authority, the influence he can now have on these men and their practices and how they went about their business and how they approached everything. Now here's why it's even more important, because if you remember Daniel, in Daniel chapter 9, God gives Daniel some very specific prophecy about when the Messiah is going to show up. So here's Daniel in charge of all the wise men, and he's given a prophecy that tells us that once you figure some things out, this is a good idea, a very close estimate of when the Messiah is going to show up, and Daniel has that knowledge. So I think there's no doubt he would have been sharing this. This is his opportunity as a man of God to influence how these wise men and magi would think. So Daniel's basically going to add biblical prophecy to all the things that they are using. Now, many years go by, and this is going to be handed down and passed from generation to generation, but I think the evidence of that is because these guys show up. they know that there is a king, a ruler of the Jews that is supposed to be born at about this time. So that's how they connect the star in the sky to what's going on in Israel. And next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about that star. So I hope that encourages you. I always love how the Word of God just fits together in some really cool, amazing ways. I hope to see everybody on Sunday, but if not, if you can't be there, hey, don't worry about that. Hope you take advantage of our online services. This is a time of year when we get just worried about a lot of things, and there's anxiety and just a lot of pressures and stuff. And so I'm excited because Dave DiDonato is going to be sharing a message about how to deal with restlessness. And also at the Washington campus, I have a really big announcement that I'm excited about, something that's going to be coming up at the Washington campus. So can't wait to tell you about that, but we're going to tell you on Sunday. And so hope to see you then. But until then, let's press on.